Um, okay, so we are live. All right, let me just get this set. Great. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 8th lecture in our Lawrence Tech College of Architecture and Design Spring Lecture Series. Just hold on one second. Sorry, had a sound issue there. Yes, welcome to the 8th lecture in our Lawrence Tech College of Architecture and Design Spring Lecture Series. My name is Emily Cudel, and I'm very happy to introduce our lecture today on behalf of the Lecture and Exhibition Committee. First, I'll say a few things about our college. The College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University offers degrees in architecture, interior design, graphic design, game art, transportation design, industrial design, and urban design. We're dedicated to a pedagogy of theory and practice, the original motto of Lawrence Technological University, advocating not one or the other, but both, integrated and coherent. And I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight, who I think is going to talk about theory explicitly, but also is really informed by her deep experience in practice. And so I'm excited to introduce Imani Day. Imani is an architect in Gensler's Detroit office. She's also an adjunct professor of design at the University of Detroit Mercy and a former editorial fellow with Columbia University's Avery Review. She is a passionate, multifaceted designer dedicated to community-oriented design, specifically in educational spaces and cultural buildings, and has served as a board member for the National Organization of Minority Architects Detroit and AIA Detroit, approaching both with the goal of making an impact through local collaborations for programming, leading important conversations in the design community, and connecting the dots for better paths to licensure. In 2020, she joined the NOMA National Board as membership co-chair. She's also a member of Gensler's Global Race and Diversity Committee. So Imani, thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to have you. And without further ado, welcome to the lecture series.
Yes, thank you. I'm really excited to be here and share some research I've been working on. So thanks for having me, for sure. So I guess I can just jump straight in, yeah? Okay. Yep. So let's see. Okay. So one, I just want to kind of briefly preface a lot of this with the idea that we as a profession have historically not ignored, but been a little bit absent in the fight for racial equity and civil rights. And more recently, we have had a much more active role. And so this presentation, number one, is hopefully there's actually more people on the call who will be familiar with this information. But this research is really starting to introduce ideas to people who are new to the idea of racial equity and who need a little bit more of a foundational understanding of how, as designers and architects, we can be more effective in the fight for racial equity. And so one, that's one aspect of it, that some of this will just be foundational information that sets the tone for the framework for how we move forward. And then the other side of this is that this is research in progress. And so as I present things, if there's something that either, one, it really is meant to be an interactive research experience. And so if something comes to mind when I am talking about something, it'd be great in the chat if you could start talking about it, or recall any experiences that you have in terms of relevance to what I'm talking about. Or if you're challenging something, if you're thinking, oh, this is something that we can expand on or maybe think differently about, or as a team, which I represent a team within my own sort of research group, and then within our Gensler research group, that is really interested and excited to talk about these issues and to get more conversations started. So before I jump into anything, like I mentioned, just bear with us, there's some in progress things. And so just looking kind of high level, thinking about inequality and how it maps out in our built environment, it is very deeply written into our built environment. And so matching that with what we can do about it, meaning architecture and activism and what we do to move that needle forward. I always like to start with just our task, or I always forget what it's actually called. It's like our motto as licensed architects. Sorry, let me just move this out of the way. That says we are kind of tasked with protecting the health, safety and welfare of the public. Yeah, a lot of times in Black and brown neighborhoods, you see these resources and that kind of theory and thought very selectively applied. And so this presentation is just beginning the conversation, and there's sort of like a really deep bank of examples of how this all plays out, but these are sort of digestible, accessible examples of how designers can respond and be a little bit better equipped to actually begin to reverse some aspects of some systemic racism that shows up in the built environment. And so kind of what I'm asking here is the health, safety, and welfare kind of goes across the board, and we say it as a part of the AIA oath. It's the oath, that's what I keep I always forget. But the biggest question is of whom, and when we decide to say that that is the case, meaning that there are countless building violations, countless conditions within schools, within housing, within commercial spaces in some cases that are not ideal, but then also in some cases very dangerous and actually it's not at all in the vein of the health, safety, and welfare of communities. And so when do we get to decide that, and why is how is that enforced? And part of that is really just that the profession itself is not always well equipped to shift policy. We're not policymakers all of the time. And as designers, there seems to be somewhat of a barrier in between. And so in a little bit of our research and just starting the conversations, we found that fewer than 40% of AIA members believe that they can impact social equity within their communities, which at first was a very shocking number to me. I was always kind of thinking it would be much higher just in terms of what you think you can do. But in this case, it actually becomes a very kind of realistic and sobering number that some AIA members just don't know. They don't have the tools to move the needle or to push their own activism forward. And in some cases, you'll see in the presentation that environmental activism is quite apparent. There are other ways that the profession has focused on protecting our own internally, but then externally for communities. It's been very kind of one-sided in terms of what we choose to do in terms of our activism. And so I like to start with these two quotes, just saying that for nearly every injustice in the world, there's an architecture that has been planned and designed to perpetuate it. And that's a Brian Lee quote from Design is Protest. He, and many other things, he's many things, but he wrote this actually, I think at some point last year, just to remind us that almost everything we experience is a reflection of one either injustice or justice. And then the top quote really talks about architectural design is never neutral. It's just understanding that we can't, that everything we do as designers is an opportunity to push social equity forward. And that if 40% of the AIA members who believe they can do it are acting at 100%, we're still missing 60% of at least AIA members and a large portion of the profession that isn't thinking actively about how change actually works. And so we have to be cognizant of these things, and that these two quotes in particular just remind me that there's nothing that can no kind of middle ground here. It's like you stand on one side and you are complicit, or you are standing on the other side and pushing toward that equity. And so, so with all of these kind of big quotes and themes, the bigger question becomes, where do we start? Like, okay, cool, all of these things. Where do we start, especially if we are a part of that 60% that feels like they cannot, or feels that that they don't have an intentional role in changing the built environment to work toward that racial equity? Where do we start? And so, as I mentioned, in progress research, we started to just do some foundational research that just grounds us in a timeline so that you understand the span of some of the things that we're still understanding and facing today. And so I won't dig too deeply into all of these, but you start to see some of the beginnings of zoning and racial segregation via zoning through actually a few different court cases. And so really the beginning, and I think what a lot of people, and where I start to think people maybe get a little bit more familiar, is the Federal Housing Administration, and how it is created to start to actually promote, just by controlling how we ensure federal mortgages and 30-year mortgages in neighborhoods. It really starts to promote that racial segregation by excluding Black people and rejecting Black loans, and starts to really fuel the aspects of redlining, which now I do hope that most people are familiar with, and we will go over it a little bit in a moment. But that's really the beginning of course, there is a previous aspect of that, but that's where we kind of get in a timeline, a harder fact of when the beginning of that redlining and the FHAs start to influence the way that we build and shape our societies. And then so in the Federal Highway Act, we start to see both in 1944 and 1956, just the funding of highways just sort of busting through and completely destroying countless Black neighborhoods across America, also tied to redlining. We'll get into that in a moment. We start to see some actually interesting responses to these, I guess, the responsibility of displacement in the 1954 Housing Act, where you get funding for a lot of units of public housing, and trying to at least find somewhere to put the people who were displaced as a result of either redlining or highways and other more intentional urban practices of urban renewal. And then actually, so what you'll see here is some of the orange is more detrimental, and then you see some of the darker blue is examples of activism and the beginnings of some of the social movements that got us to really positive aspects of moving forward today. And so you see the beginning of accessible design standards in 1958, which starts to understand and build the foundational blocks for the Americans with Disabilities Act, what we call ADA today, which completely revolutionized and changed the way we design to focus on accessibility. We see just more civil rights laws that focus on prohibiting discrimination, even more fair housing acts that focus on prohibiting discrimination in terms of renting and actually securing housing and security. And then you still start to see this is a pivotal moment, actually, in what I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, that Whitney M. Young Jr. in that famous speech at the AIA convention that year, just denouncing the profession of architecture for the quote unquote thunderous silence of our profession in the fight for civil rights. And so it starts to, you'll see kind of maybe in the next couple of slides, that there's a lot of good that comes out of that. There's mobility and people actually starting to mobilize themselves to be a part of the fight for civil rights, both for the profession itself and then for the societies in which we build. And so it's not in here, and like I mentioned, in progress research, but actually shortly after the AI convention that year, you see the formation of NOMA. You start to see actually just more toxic chemicals and the response to actually just controlling contaminants in our building materials. But then you also start to see the idea of land being used in a different way, and the contamination of actual land and how that contributes to the health of communities. And you actually start to see the final passing of the literal law of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a lot more activism in terms of when LEAD begins via that sort of activation of AI in the 60 firms, just to start to move towards sustainable practices and understanding energy conservation. Then more activism through CEED, more activism with Black Lives Matter. You actually start to see within the community engagement process in 2001, from what we understand, that is one of the first examples of a community benefits agreement where you start to systemically build the community's voice into the development process. And since then, it has drastically changed and hopefully improved. In some cases, it is not improved and not been ideal, but we like to see the positive movement out of the community benefits agreement and how that starts to influence the shaping of societies and neighborhoods. You see a little bit more of equity by design, design as protest, AIA jumping back into influence the conversation in 2015. And at least getting some structure around equity in architecture through the commission of architects and educators and diversity experts to begin the conversation. And actually a lot of what we see here is that up until last year, a lot of these things were not at the forefront of many conversations and could fall to the wayside just because the priorities were very different in 2015. And at the same time, you see some of the advancement and then a couple steps, actually a lot of steps back in examples such as the Flint water crisis, and then actually just getting us home to Detroit. Just thinking about our Detroit public schools, the conditions within those, within the buildings, the toxic environments within the buildings, and then just as you see news headlines, the positive testing of the drinking water in the schools for lead and copper. And so just a little bit more information. This is really just pushing and pulling on, steps forward and steps backwards in terms of policy, equity, and activism. You do see some movement and exciting things that don't necessarily have all to do with racial equity, but the shifting and changing of building codes and plumbing codes is actually really, really difficult to do. And all change that happens in the architectural code and our rules often takes many years, if not decades, to change. And so they're not small things, but they are things that could potentially go unnoticed, that the gender neutrality just in our signage has changed as proposed by the A and many people around the US and probably beyond, to just change a rule about signage, which doesn't even drastically change the entire building, but it has such a massive impact on a community that really needs and deserves an equitable environmental response. And so just moving forward and just very high level, just thinking through what it takes and what are the different avenues of people who and structures that you move through to actually change things. And so we know that AA hosts a lot of our lobbyists and the actual political movement that happens within the architectural community. So in terms of activism, in terms of advocacy, AA a lot of times is leading that conversation, is the most visible. And so NOMA also, plus I would say NOMA plus a lot of let's say sister organizations and adjacent and aligned organizations also start to very much so enter the world of advocacy, just in terms of all professionals of color, and raising the voice and the challenges and the priorities of the professional in our communities of color. And so moving through that, there are various barriers and structures within our profession in general, but thinking through NCARB and NAB and what is required of both of these institutions in terms of racial equity, and what we learn about it and what we are required to know about it in the built environment is actually really, really minimal, really, almost non-existent, especially in my education. And I know now things are changing and there's actually quite a bit of movement just to change curricula. But thinking through, if you are licensed, what aspect of that had anything to do with you understanding racial equity as it relates to the built environment? Very little. NAB as well, just what is a part of your base requirements when you were in school, to understand any of the things that we're about to talk about or any of the things that we just did talk about in that timeline. And then so moving even beyond that to actual laws and changing our codes and enforcing our codes. There's a number of different ways. One, for instance, and is probably the most popular and well-known, is that ADA is actually mandated nationally by the Department of Justice. And so our building codes are very much so state and local jurisdiction mandated and controlled. And so there are many different avenues and ideas of how you get activated and how you actually can make an impact, but there, in this whole presentation, hopefully by the end of it, you understand that there are multiple avenues and a super multifaceted approach to how you can engage in your community, if not on a national level, in like on your block alone. You have a lot of options, and one interesting aspect of this is that sometimes these can be paralyzing because there's so many ways that you can be active, but I don't think there's a fairness in saying anything along the lines of you cannot have an impact on social equity in your community. And so just super high level, there's probably a ton more here that we can dig a little bit deeper into, but just thinking through the ways, and without me even saying anything, if I start to talk about housing, you could probably imagine just the disparities within the housing policy and actual housing supply and market within the US, the disparities based on race and socioeconomic status. Educational spaces, as I mentioned, just in Detroit, we have, and I don't want to say perfect because it's not ideal, but we have really examples that are right in our backyard of educational spaces that are complicit in injustice and actual racial injustice. And so without going too deeply into all of these things, we'll probably, we look at a couple of case studies here, but thinking through carceral spaces, and we actually won't touch carceral spaces because that's a lecture in itself and has almost an endless amount of conversation around the injustices built into our justice system and injustice spaces. But thinking through commercial spaces, healthcare disparities, and environmental racism, there's just a really strong layered approach to where you focus your energy and how they start to at least talk to each other, how some of the histories of these spaces also start to really reflect and interestingly intertwine. And so I want to kind of break this down into some things that are that we might consider systemic versus policy-based, and then actual just experiential direct design implications that we can see and feel today. And so I want to talk just, I don't want to lean too, I need to maybe check on time. Okay, so for housing policy, as I mentioned, sort of the beginning and hopefully the beginning of what becomes a little bit more familiar to you is the first FHA, and there are many FHAs, but in this case, the FHA, that is the Federal Housing Administration, that starts to really found and fuel the racial segregation and financial backing of how our communities are shaped and who is included and versus excluded from certain resources and neighborhoods themselves. And so this a lot of times is what you really start to see as a strong foundation for where the inequality, where if you try to really harken back to something that is more tangible, this is a really tangible aspect of inequality that is still being shown in the built environment. And so without going too deeply into redlining, this is really just in case anyone doesn't understand what it is. So as a result of the FHA controlling and introducing the federally insured 30-year mortgage, that promoting of the racial segregation is coming from refusing to back loans in Black neighborhoods and Black homeowners. And so not only does that play out in what we see as the wealth gap now and ensuring that equity in your neighborhood is even a possibility, the redlining is actually just enclosing areas that were deemed unfit for investment and left undeveloped or left in disrepair. And so when the effort with an already disadvantaged community, the effort to try to improve or replace businesses and economies that had maybe failed or were struggling, there's no real way economically to improve your neighborhood. There's no investment in any improvements to your community, and you don't really have a ton of control as a Black member trying to buy or trying to live in these areas. The map on the right is just showing a map of Oakland and some of the redlined areas there. And so just in terms of healthcare, access to groceries, retail, and actual economic opportunity, you control the actual physical nature of your city by redlining and excluding people from that opportunity and the ability to have that social progress. And so thinking from 1934, redlining was actually outlawed, I believe, in 1968. But even in 2020, we see how redlining actually applies directly to our societies today. And you can see it actually in Detroit. You can see it in many cities across America. But thinking through the actual redlined areas of cities that today are literally warmer because of that disinvestment in the urban scape of their communities, meaning there's no investment in any greenscaping, there's no trees, there's a lot more hardscape. So there's very little the actual urban heat mapping of the neighborhood today as a part of understanding the results of global warming and climate change disproportionately still affect Black and Brown neighborhoods because of that prolonged and existing different investment in your neighborhoods. And in this case, you'll see that a lot of the neighborhoods that were not previously redlined, that had white families and communities, actually had the ability to influence how their neighborhoods were invested in and think very intentionally about getting resources poured directly into their blocks and into their homes. So you see that literally those areas are now even cooler, literally cooler, like in terms of temperature. And so redlining in so many ways, though it is now being talked about so much, and this was actually just an article from the New York Times last year that almost was a discovery of how redlining and global warming overlap each other. And so there's a number of different ways that redlining and just sort of urban, racial urban practices or racist urban practices really dig deeply into our physical existence today. And so it's not a historical thing that we can kind of ignore or think differently about. It's something that we still have to combat on a very serious level today as a part of some of our other priorities that historically also don't or rarely kind of integrate that racial equity into something like climate change or global warming that will almost always disproportionately affect our Black and Brown communities. And so I know the timeline is jumping around a bit, but this is just actually trying to get everyone to understand that the history of this is not as far back as it seems. And so looking directly at another just political act, that is the Federal Highway Act, that funded the creation of 41,000 miles of interstate highways. And as you can see, as you will see, sorry, in the next couple of slides, a lot of those highways, and in Detroit we can definitely see it, and we will see it in a moment, were intentionally placed and cut through Black neighborhoods, in some cases that were really strong and really thriving Black neighborhoods. And regardless of whether they're thriving, it was intentional to place them in these sort of undesirable and still sort of redlined areas. And so one special aspect of this, I think, is that, and I don't know that, and you guys tell me, I don't know if this is something that everyone's like, oh, we know, this is like, I think about this all the time when I'm working on a site that is adjacent to a highway, or when I think about roads in general. I understand that this is a very heavily racially charged act to even have a highway, but then on top of it, what neighborhoods did we cut through and what neighborhoods did we destroy? By just being able to travel from, I don't know, here to south. I don't have a car, so I don't know the highways here as well, but in order for me to get from here to Ferndale or something, what it means. And when I'm actually a designer working with communities, and what you'll see in a moment is you really need to understand that history, so that when you're working with neighbors and actual community members, you're not approaching in an ignorant or uninformed way, and how you are able to influence their neighborhood can mean that you are trying to at least mend or repair some of the cutting through of the neighborhoods. And so just looking at a project, this is 12th in Claremont, which so you can see Woodward here, and Claremont here. And so what we can start to see here is that in 1906, 1923, you start to see these urban fabrics that are becoming stronger and closer and more dense, stronger communities there. This is the Herman Kiefer development, since it's so blatantly outlined. And so when you start to think through the urban fabric of this neighborhood and then plowing through it with the M10, you start to see that this neighborhood that once was one thing becomes two things, which, if you can imagine your own neighborhood right now, think about if your neighbor that is right next to you, one, had to leave because the highway is coming, but then what happens to that neighbor? What happens to you? What happens to your community that you trust and know really well? What happens to the businesses that potentially are on the street that is now kind of shifted and plowed through? In this case, you start to see, actually shortly after, via both urban practices and race relations in the city, you start to see, and what you can kind of see here is in the historic figure ground of 1925, you see how healthy these blocks are. You see that these are close-knit, tight neighborhoods that have a really different, just kind of visual diagrammatic view, but thinking through just complete corner conditions, consistent street walls, thinking through safety and amenities and resources in your neighborhood, and then thinking through what happens to that neighborhood, once you plow through and sort of separate this from an active and healthy economic driver, but then over the course of time, how that actually deteriorates your community, to show the existing figure ground in 2017, where this is very much so definitely connected, all the way from the Highway Act of 1944 and 56, all the way through to today. I mean, this is from 2017, but I would be definitely very shocked if this area had changed very drastically. We've seen that the city of Detroit has poured some resources into a neighborhood framework plan so that we can see these neighborhoods revitalized. But it's almost exciting and interesting to think about what our urban fabric looks like if you don't have these specific and intentional sort of racist practices pushing directly through these historically Black neighborhoods. And I don't even want to say too much about Black Bottom because Emily Cutil is on the call, and I really don't know much more than what I've seen her say. But just in terms of the Highway Act, you start to see, as I mentioned, these Black Bottoms, the Paradise Valleys being completely destroyed by I-375 and 75, where if you look at this fabric and understand all of the thriving Black businesses in the actual neighborhood that is Black Bottom or that is Paradise Valley, and then seeing what becomes of it today, as we see the highways cutting through, but then also the deterioration of certain neighborhoods and blocks, and then where you actually do see the reinvestment and the displacement intentionally to put something else in place that responds to or really rejects the idea of thriving Black communities and just the erasure of Black communities. And so you can see this a little bit more, obviously, again, not trying to teach everybody about redlining, but you can see this specifically here, just that is Black Bottom and Paradise Valley in this little circular area here that was previously redlined, and you see that the highway actually cuts through it. That is intentional. And the deterioration of both neighborhoods and the surrounding neighborhoods as well. That is not by chance. And like I said, if you know this already, great. If you don't, then you actually think very differently about the developments that are there now, and then the vacant land and how those are developed moving forward. You really start to think differently about what your priorities are in terms of responding to filling the void of erasure or responding to a very racially charged history with an intense amount of actual just trauma, both physically and mentally, emotionally. The communities that's still there who have maybe been shifted around and or completely erased and are not either in the city or in the actual bounds of Detroit anymore. You speak to the communities in a different way when you are actually informed, and then just thinking through how we praise and not prioritize, but put some of these developments on pedestals because maybe a fancy architect worked on them, whatever the case may be. You think really differently, and your attitude maybe shifts a little bit when you understand what it took to actually put those developments there. And so, again, just looking at one aspect of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, the Housing Act of 1954 marks a pivotal moment in the US housing policy, again, where they start to fund the units of public housing, giving quote unquote preferential treatment to families that would have been, that needed to be relocated from slum, quote unquote, which this really should be in quotes, slum clearance and revitalization. And so in some ways, I think this is a controversial topic, especially within some of the conversations that I've had, where trying to find space for the displaced is an idea, I think, that was potentially originally well-intentioned, but then turns into some of the public housing issues that we've seen in America today that actually still sustain and reinforce some racially damaging, I think, or damaging to Black and Brown communities of urban renewal, and now, again, racially separating the neighborhoods. Almost removing some of the, what is the right word? Some of the resources and actual investment in those communities, as well as you start to see them deteriorate over time. And one thing that I'm really excited about, and what I kind of want to mention again, is that, just because now I'm kind of harping on some of the negative things, is that there is an aspect of these housing acts and the detrimental aspects of things that actually activates people and motivates people to do something about the historical wrongings of the past. And so I'm actually kind of excited. This is not necessarily a a direct project that will come to fruition soon, but even in our education, we're starting to see the shifting of how we work with students and what we emphasize with students. I am teaching a design studio that focuses on the NOMA student competition brief that is meant to revitalize the project site that you see here, that is the previous Brewster Douglas Homes project housing site. And so just thinking through the idea that previously this would not likely be a studio, number one, also taught by Black professors. There's a lot of kind of momentum there just within one studio that starts to teach differently. But then also just thinking about how many aspects of this, as I teach the students, I have to be well equipped to pass on knowledge to them, and then pass on prioritizing how we start to redevelop sites like this, understanding that the developments that you see here and the new Brewster homes here, there's a lot of the history that I just mentioned that plays out in this site very specifically. You also see 375 that cut through the neighborhood. I can maybe show it again here. So the project site that we're talking about is here, and then you start to see it here again, where the housing and the tight-knit community that could have been on that site at the time now becomes, in today's age, just a completely vacant open site, again, with a lot of really interesting racially charged histories. So getting back to this, one, just thinking through urban form, I'll check my time, I'm almost done. Thinking through the urban form, and then how you actually would go about teaching students to respond responsibly. And then thinking through also the environmental aspects of this, what I just mentioned, what it means just in terms of these developments and how they looked, what resources and what intentional investments in the green infrastructure there, understanding then the other urban influences that start to influence why the deterioration of the site is what it was. And so it's kind of this is also another lecture in itself, but just thinking through these housing projects over top of what used to be Paradise Valley, and the deterioration of the site, then the eventual kind of demolition of the site, and what's left there now for decades actually is just a kind of big open site that has a lot of opportunity, but then also has all of that sort of deeper history that really needs to be acknowledged before you put anything on the site. Same thing with all of the brush park developments here, and even adjacent to where we see the formation of Eastern Market as well. All communities here, and what I just showed in all of that mapping actually has a lot of really deep, just urban history that I believe is necessary to know if you're going to be an architect practicing in this city, but then also in a lot of various cities around America. And so stepping back from housing policy necessarily, and just like that sort of really massive national understanding, there's some experiential differences that I think also start to maybe jog your thoughts and your memory on, oh, like there are aspects of our architectural practice that are actually quite disturbing, that are opportunities for us to potentially reverse and respond to with our own ideas and combating that racist attitude. And so I don't know that this happens often in Detroit, and I'm actually not from Detroit, I'm from the New York and New Jersey area. And so I practiced in New York for quite some time on higher end residential projects. And something that actually came up quite often far before 2013 was the idea that if you have to have affordable units as a part of your development requirements in actually cities all over the place. This is actually, a lot of this comes from a London example, actually. And so if you have to have a mandatory amount of affordable units, you can actually, because at the time there was no policy to say you couldn't, you can put in a separate entrance for your for their affordable units. And so we called, and as it is named, a poor door experientially, because if you are not as wealthy as some of the other tenants in the building, you are asked to use a separate entry and a separate actual circulation system in some cases, so that you're almost just unseen, unheard. And so thinking through that, one, the designer has the ability to respond to the developer or client and say, excuse me, that is absolutely not okay. But in a lot of cases, and actually if you just Google the word poor door, you'll see that this happens more often than you think. In a lot of cases, New York actually put some temporary policy in place to combat this. But in reality, a lot of other cities and a lot of other developers don't actually have to respond to this. There's no law, there's no policy that says that you can't. It's up to the designer and actually up to the developer both to understand what that means in terms of discriminatory behavior and in terms of physical discrimination in the built environment based on your socioeconomic status. And so there's an opportunity here, one, for it to become illegal for you to do this, or become unacceptable for you to do this through whatever happens in your inspections, in your actual design practices. It should not be allowed that this is something that can continue to happen. So we have that ability. And you can see it here. There are, in some cases, this is the main entry and lobby into a space. And then you see here cars, because this is an alley and a parking sort of back of house area. This is an entry for the affordable units. You can see it here just from New York Post. Like, this is the main entry that is invested in, and then the poor door is kind of around the corner in a back alley where it is very much so concealed. It's not something that developers want you to see or understand that they did. And so again, here, there's just a clear difference in the investment and the dollars being put toward actually just intentional discrimination, so that you just don't have to deal with the urban, the disadvantaged. And a lot of times, as we know, those often become the Black and Brown community members. And so just very quickly moving through a little bit of more of the educational justice. In Detroit, there was an actual very large and long lawsuit just suing for the right to read. And I just kind of copied and pasted from the Detroit news area here, where one student actually just was like, this is unacceptable and we have to do something about it. And actually, this is Osborne High School, in a school that I worked on temporarily as a volunteer effort, not commissioned by anybody. But I remember walking into the school, the dimly lit hallways, smelling mold. I never saw any dead mice in the bathrooms, but I did see the principal told me that she hasn't been able to use 2 floors of the building because of flood damage for years and years of time. And so if you think about it, when I walked into school, there was students still wearing their coats because the heating system just had failed. And so there are conditions within our Detroit public schools that are prohibiting and hindering a student's ability to learn. And so, as we know, the majority of DPS is Black and Brown students. What does that mean when you step outside of the city of Detroit and see that maybe those neighborhoods and city and counties maybe have different demographics and get completely different treatment? You see really different applications of the school conditions and just different ideas of what is deserved in a learning space. And so, and this will bring me kind of to the last point, is even so, even the conditions are poor, then we see an aspect of this that is that actually just breaks down into toxic contaminants in the water. And actually, most of it wasn't even like, oh no, we have to do something about this right now. And of course, DPS faces a lot of different financial issues that may not mean that you respond to this thing specifically first. However, you bag up the water fountains, you tape them off. The testing of the water actually wasn't even required. And this was almost like a bonus that they knew and that they could control this before it got maybe to a different level, and that there are actually acceptable levels of lead and copper in drinking water to begin with as a part of the plumbing code, and that there are unions that are protected in whether they have to respond by completely ripping out infrastructure to resolve these issues. There's layers of protection and there's layers of this discrimination that by all means, designers, though we're not plumbers, we're not in the plumbing unions or controlling plumbing code, we do have the ability to influence what happens in a building, and we do have the ability to influence our consultants and what is acceptable as a condition within a school, especially as a public institution, and for our future generations. And so these were a few different examples of just how, one, we are so ingrained, a lot of these things are so ingrained in our built environment today, and then there are still things happening very recently that we have an ability to have a say over and to be active about. And so one aspect of the research group that we're working on within Gensler is just trying to make this an accessible and digestible type of information that if you are new to the conversation, you have the ability to sort of read a chunk of newsletters that no, we're not ever going to be the experts on every single piece of this timeline and of this newsletter. But you have the ability to at least know, like, okay, I didn't know that environmental racism plays out in these ways. I'm interested in becoming more active in it. Can I click into this and find out who is the expert in it and how I actually can get more involved? In my neighborhood, I know I'm noticing that I can relate and I understand that some of these issues are still an issue in my neighborhood, in my backyard. How do I actually engage, and how can I just at least be aware so that we're not moving forward in a complacent and complicit way? And so the goal is to have sort of this ongoing understanding and dishing out of information so that designers are well equipped to start responding in their own individual experiences. And so I'll end, and I know I said I would end, but I will end with the quote that equity cannot be optional. And if you think about it now, a lot of what I just mentioned is very much so an optional action for designers to either engage with or completely ignore. And it's not okay to ignore any of these aspects, especially now with the responsibility that we have as architects to shape our communities. It's just not something that I think can fall to the wayside or can be something that people can opt out of. And so leaving you with this quote that equity cannot be optional, maybe it jogs your or sort of sparks in your mind where equity is optional. And that's what this research is about. When have we made it okay for people to ignore certain aspects of the built environment that are just inherently racist? And so thank you. I have a lot of people to thank, so I just kind of put them on top of the screen for now, a lot of the references that I use as well. And like I said, if something in this presentation feels interesting or feels like you want to talk more about it, you want to think more about it, please reach out to me on via email or on Instagram. And just like I said, this is meant to be kind of an interactive thing that is an ongoing experience that designers can engage with. And so as we build the infrastructure for what that looks like, and you feel like you want to participate, please let me know, because there's power in numbers. And so thank you. I don't know if we do Q&A now. I know I took up a lot of time.
We do, and we typically will have at least 20 minutes of Q&A. So we'll stick around probably until 7:15, 7:20, or if there are lots of questions, we can also keep going. Okay. So Imani, thank you so much. That was a really enlightening and really interesting talk, and I appreciate it, especially in the context of the studio that I'm teaching right now in ID4. All of the students who are juniors right now in Lawrence Tech are studying urban systems and trying to understand how architects and urban designers can impact large systemic issues that they see playing out in the city. And so I think, the conversation that you are starting today, I think is I hope that lots of ID4 students are listening and that they have questions to ask Imani, because I think, even some of the really specific issues that you brought up, like lead and water, our students in ID4 are trying to ask questions about how as architects we can work on that. And so.
Oh no. Emily, if you're talking, I can't hear you anymore.
That sometimes happens to Emily. It's okay. she'll come back soon. Imani, maybe I can ask a question while she does come back.
Sure. Apologies.
She's back.
Apologies.
So, yeah,
sorry about that.
First of all, thank you so much, Imani. It was a great lecture, and I'm not sure why all of our ID4 students weren't here live for it, but my guess is they will see it tomorrow and they'll see it soon. I think what's incredible to me is that it's often felt like there's a split between practice and academia, where it's been academia would critique these things of the profession. And I think it's really exciting to me that you're bringing a lot of this criticism and bringing about a lot of this change from within the profession, which is again just incredibly exciting. How, and maybe to like Emily was saying a second ago, how do you see some of these things playing out kind of on the ground? I think what you gave us tonight was a broad picture of these things and helping us understand them historically. And so like I don't know, maybe an example from like client-driven work or discussions that you might have within your firm, how do some of these things play out, or how are you actively working on them?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of different ways. I would say most of the work that I do in Detroit actually lends itself very kindly to these examples that I just put on the screen, where I've learned about some of these things through my work, meaning the 12th in Claremont, which will take me forever to get back to, but absolutely was something that I needed to, that I didn't come into the conversation knowing all of these things about how the neighborhood had developed and changed. And in order for me to be able to engage with any communities and suggest anything, or even think through an urban planning strategy for an entire community that had faced a lot of different issues in sort of racial urban practices, it becomes something that I get deeply kind of shocked by when people don't know about it now, only where, like, for instance, if a teammate or if someone, and that's not been the case on my projects, actually, I learned the most from my teammates, but I would think through potentially if another firm was working on this project and didn't have that same foundational research to begin, then what becomes of that project, what becomes of that design. And so speaking on an urban level, that's one way, just kind of, this is a real project that I worked on and was really proud to see some of that knowledge being put to work. But the flip side of it is that there are areas of Detroit that are vacant and potentially suffering from just not having really any resources. Sometimes they're unidentified neighborhoods, or neighborhoods that don't even have a really strong specific identity, that need recreational centers, that need economic drivers being put into them so that they have that anchor. And so I've worked on a project which is called Merritt Park, and hopefully will be online soon, that just thinks about the history of a neighborhood and what the needs are of the neighborhood, and combining those things into something that is progressive and that can socially innovate in that world, through an urban park, through a recreational park, or for instance the project that was shown as a part of the advertisement for this is Detroit is the New Black. That ability for that company to exist and be downtown is still really rooted in a lot of knowledge and why that is important for that to be the case, and for a Black-owned business to be anchored on that major retail corridor that virtually does not really exist a ton more once you move kind of up and down. They're sprinkled up and down Woodward, but just thinking about the ability and opportunity to work on projects like that with the foundation of knowledge that you actually have of the history, one, of the city, but then also of these urban practices, is just a really interesting thing where I as a student never really had the opportunity to understand where I might be able to apply some of this information, and didn't really have the information to begin with. But in actual practice, the ability to do both, I think, has been one of the most fulfilling things for me as a professional. And I think it isn't really emphasized enough that it's possible for students to actually do both, where you can be very deeply rooted in research and academia and understanding just kind of theory-based how to approach strategy at all for anything, for any design solution, and then be able to literally directly apply it from a day-to-day, because I'm doing research at some point, and also practicing doing the exact same thing at another level in the same day or day-to-day sometimes. And so that's been something that's really exciting for me and something that's possible both independently and at Gensler, but really Gensler gives you a lot of opportunities to have both. And so, yeah, if that answers the question, I hope that it came close.
It does answer it. And I would say it's fascinating to me, like you talked a lot about the highway system and what it did to Detroit. I think it did that across the entire country.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I'm trying to imagine a scenario where maybe, I don't know, I hesitate to say this, but like much of it may have had the best intentions, and there may have almost just been almost like maybe a laziness, like either, and neither of these are good, like a laziness of like, oh, there's going to be the least resistance to cut through here because it doesn't have the value, or a completely racist approach that is like, we're going to cut through the middle of this neighborhood and try and divide that. In both cases, there's almost like an algorithm that can be run. And so thinking about new practices with artificial intelligence, where we see unintended consequences of a kind of algorithm that's running through that, and just imagining or maybe hoping for a way that clearly there's nothing operating at the scale of the highway system for new infrastructure these days.
Right.
But maybe there's a way, maybe it's more emergent urbanism, maybe it's more has to do with ecological issues and other things, that there may be a way to reverse some of those unintended consequences that we see. Like I don't know, like to understand these things is like, there's clearly a race component that was at play. And I wonder like how explicit it was. Like no one's really, I don't know if anyone's writing the story or telling the history of like the actual conversation that occurred in those rooms of the planners where they're deciding which neighborhood to cut through and what that was like. But it certainly appears a certain way now.
Yeah, there's certainly, and what I'll say about any example that I showed here, like I said, I'm not the expert on it, but when you, like if you just put the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 and a separate sort of precursor to it in 1944, there is a breadth of like information of how and why, the development of the highway system. Really, it talks a little bit more about a defense system and just progressing in terms of transit, rapid transit. It's like there is an intention where you can see like, yeah, that probably makes a ton of sense, but why did we have to cut through Black Bottom? It's just like, okay, we probably could have, and now you're seeing that actually 375 and 75 are under kind of like a full configuring, because in some ways they were not planned well, like they weren't ideal for actually the implementation that you see today. So the revising of that is just proof of the fact that these were not fully thought through decisions to begin with. But in some cases, yes, they probably were based in something. And the debates that I've had about this one in particular is like, well, I don't want to take an hour to get to Royal Oak or whatever. I don't know how long it takes to get there all the time, but I think it's just an interesting thought of convenience and thinking about just natural progression of things like transit, and then who we sort of erase and affect the most by trying to get that convenience built into our American experience. And so, yeah, it's definitely not just Detroit. And in fact, I tried to make this presentation a little bit more Detroit focused, just because this is LTU and we are in Detroit, and the projects that I've worked on probably speak the most to it. But I think, yeah, like I said, I almost wanted to put like little links to every single aspect of what is in this presentation, because you could spend years just on the Federal Aid Highway Act, every single portion of this, like every example, you could spend, you know, one lecture just kind of scraping the surface of it. And so I find that to be super interesting. I don't know that this research ever really ends for me, but yeah, definitely an interesting point. And which parts of it were like, this is a Black community, let's just put it there. But I mean, they were redlined to be undesirable and disinvested. So they were actually, it probably cost less to do something in those neighborhoods. And so I could see the logic financially, the racial aspect, and actually just being a fly on the wall during that time would be beyond me as a research or academic person. And so, yeah, interesting thought.
I thank you for bearing with me with my connection problem. Sorry about that. I want to ask a question that Anusha Veradandi posted in the chat, who's actually the president, right, Anusha, of our LTU NOMA chapter. Anusha, do you want to ask the question out loud, or do you want me to ask it?
Yeah, sure, that's fine. Yeah, the question was like, what are some examples, like what the most like efficient way, because this is such a complex problem, like what do you think would be the most efficient ways to amend like the separations of these communities? And then as well as like, have you seen any progress like within the projects you've been part of, or like within Gensler, within the Detroit area?
So to answer the question of have I seen any progress, so there are multiple neighborhood revitalization framework plans happening all the time. And so yes, within my experience at Gensler, I've seen some progress. And at least I think the concept of the city of Detroit funding the research and the actual, you know, really smarter strategy for how to revitalize is progress in itself, because that's not always the case. There's certain areas of Detroit that likely will not get a framework or revitalization framework plan. And so the first step, and what's interesting about urban revitalization as opposed to like a boutique retail build out like Detroit's New Black that takes some months, versus urban revitalization takes sometimes decades and decades to just see really smaller movement. And so I think the gathering of neighborhoods, the actual community engagement process actually is one step forward always in getting the community to start thinking about what actually is possible, and then presenting what, you know, in urban form is possible is a step forward. And yes, there are kind of developments popping up all around town via a couple of different framework plans that I've seen some really interesting progress for. And so the most efficient way to mend the separations within the communities, that's a tough question for me. I don't know the most efficient way to mend the separations, but I do know that a lot of times the separations are either erasing either economic corridor, like retail corridors, actual programmed corridors that displace businesses and displace members of the community. And one way to mend that is actually just the economic growth and like intentionally funding, replacing and actually resituating those companies and stores and things to be able to thrive in a downtown economy or be a part of the actual thriving aspects of downtown Detroit or within Detroit itself. They have to be able to survive and thrive And so some of that is less urban application, more kind of like economic thought of how we make sure that those businesses can exist and survive where they are. But then I also think it's just like, for instance, on the, let's see if I can get back to it. This makes me really happy because my students are investigating this. So as a part of the 375 reconfiguration with 75, you can see here on this project site, which plowed through a pretty tight knit and solid urban fabric, you see here that this site where the housing projects were, move this over, you see where the housing projects and this whole kind of site was, you see a really teeny little pedestrian bridge here that gets you to Eastern Market, but it's not the part of Eastern Market that you want to be in as so readily. This is a really large kind of industrial development that is really, really not ideal for pedestrian movement between these two sites. And so if you think about it, you have Woodward moving kind of north-south here, and then I think you have Russell, if I'm correct, moving north-south in the Eastern Market area. This sort of like spaghetti junction here actually doesn't reroute you to get to either of those places ideally right now. But the reconfiguration of 375 actually has a vehicular path with, I want to say bike lanes and sidewalks and things that actually gets you from a development such as this kind of on the outskirts of what you would call Brush Park and just the boundaries before you get to the highway. There is an actual physical connection that leads you back to a retail corridor that takes you into an actual nice pedestrian experience in Eastern Market. And so simple things like just this little toothpick pedestrian bridge is one thing that is quote unquote connecting, right? Or like Mack Avenue connecting, like fine, those things are connecting physically for vehicular access. I think driving the retail of what might be an Eastern Market economy and a Woodward economy by connecting these two more intentionally is an actual efficient connector, so that this, if you put anything here that is retail or residential or commercial, it can thrive because now it's not just kind of on like a service drive that is also undesired. It's not an ideal pedestrian experience. I think, or driving experience, you actually start to get that efficient connector back and forth. And so that's a really small example and an actual very literal example, but I think it actually just magnifies how many other things, if you just think more wisely about how you're actually planning and intervening, like the interventions that you actually can put into your projects, they can drastically change whether the success of a project that we put here. If we put a bunch of retail here, it likely is going to fail because of just the highway being here. If we put residential here, there's a lot of aspects of the site that are challenging because of all of the fuel fumes, all of the noise and issues that come with being adjacent to a highway. But if you give the right experience to get back and forth from the economic drivers that we have, then you have a really different approach to the site. And so I don't even know if I should be saying this to LTU students while I'm trying to lead UDM into victory, but I think that's what I would say is just, it's being super intentional about the connections that you do make and what they are connecting. If you're going to put a new development or connect an existing development to some like thriving economies and neighborhoods.
Thank you. I was just saying the site is kind of similar with the highway connections and how many highways there are to the Oakland one we did last year.
There's a ton of similarities there, which is exciting to see. I wonder what will be different about the responses to it. But yeah, I've seen some similarities too.
Thank you so much, Imani. I have a question about how we as architects or as architectural educators sort of operate. I'm wondering, and I think it was so helpful to see you sort of lay out your kind of roadmap for how, you know, all these different kind of ways that racism is showing up in policy, in the built environment, in large ways and in small ways. And I wonder how, so often when we start talking about these kind of like large issues like housing policy or, you know, freeway policy, people will say that that's not architecture, right? That that's urban planning, or that that's, you know, public policy, or that's politics, but it's not architecture. And I wonder if you could talk maybe a little bit for our architecture students who are watching about how as architects we can engage with these things, and maybe how we need to operate differently in order to be able to engage with these things.
Yeah, I think so. For me, that's kind of what the end of the presentation is about, is like that equity being optional. And I've gotten a lot of pushback just in terms of even talking to industry experts saying like, hey, if I go into a building and the water is contaminated, but you want me to like do some interior design, or like you want me to do some architecture to shift some things around, I have an issue with that, because I'm going to leave the building and the people in it are still not going to be able to get water. And that is like a much bigger issue than what I might consider to be like more cosmetic changes. Or for instance, if the heat isn't working, no, I'm not a mechanical engineer, but what does it matter what I do within the building if the heat isn't going to work, or if there's mold, or if there's an issue where we're not really ready to abate or really ready to respond? There, to me, is a bit of an order of operations. I think that fundamentally, though we won't be the ones, you know, literally going into the pipes and understanding corrosion and all of those things, we don't need to be those people. There is a whole aspect of architecture, and that's kind of why I brought up AIA a little bit. And this is not a commercial for AIA, but there's so much policy and advocating built into the AIA system and built in actually into NOMA. Where, for instance, AIA grassroots, you know, becoming a citizen architect, if you're not familiar with those two things, is actually just trying to combine legislation and architecture so that things like climate change, which like all of a sudden architects are, you know, like we know all the things about sustainability and climate change, but like we're not, like we play a part in it. We play a part in so many different social issues, but are we the ones controlling energy efficiency? Like we don't make lights either, but we do specify lights. We do have to be very conscious of how we are integrating ourselves into the rest of the building systems. And so to me, it's not something that, it is not optional. It's like, it's something that I can't really ignore or not talk about and not, at the very least, not be informed about. It's the social responsibility. And like I said, if the beginning of this presentation, and you can look it up when you become a licensed architect, or if you practice in America at the very least, the oath says, we are here to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And that means a very different thing to a lot of different architects. And like the presentation also says, a large majority of our profession doesn't feel responsible for how the built environment works. And that's really strange. I think it's a really strange thing that you put kind of a cap on your what you're planning to do to be helpful in society, or to be vocal about in society. And so I consider the health, safety, and welfare, like your health, if you are putting, if racial zoning ordinances allow for industrial developments in your residential backyard, basically, and you are now facing you know, issues with lung cancer or the community health now, a community health crisis is happening because there's too many diesel fumes around you, there's too many, the dust from whatever industrial development is behind you is now in your in your air and in your food if you decide to go outside your house. That's an issue that, though I'm not, on a zoning board, I have to be really conscious of if I'm going into a community and going to put, I just had this experience actually where I'm trying to put a training facility that is a construction and kind of demolition training facility. And some people came to the community meeting saying, I struggle with this, it's going to increase truck traffic. There's a school, there's kids, there's all of these aspects of this development that alarm me. We're already having kind of like lung issues. We're seeing that the community is physically not as healthy. That's the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Like I'm putting a project somewhere, I'm literally only going to do architectural interventions for a client. But I have to be really conscious. And then my response to that concern is, well, I actually have to now research in a really different way how we combat any transmission of those fumes, or what are the design implications of how you respond to something like that, is really important. But if I'm not aware and if I don't understand what it means historically for a Black community that was previously redlined to be adjacent to an industrial park now, and seeing what that does to the community health, then I'm like at the community meeting like, okay, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to do it how we want to do it. We're going to design it so that it looks good, but probably is still unhealthy to you guys. And so there's so many aspects of this that will not be architecture literally, and will not always be what we are taught as theory in school. But I think the social change and the social responsibility that we have is still the same. And to me, that's what's shocking about when you become an architect. You don't learn anything about the histories of injustice built into our profession. You don't learn anything about ignorance in our profession or the ability to ignore. And so it's you can't, for instance, with ADA is a social movement that doesn't happen as if architects just decide that architecture is cut and dry and very kind of like finite, like our responsibilities are finite. ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is decades and decades of activism and lobbying and lawyers and architects for sure, but also just citizens that were like, excuse me, I can't use some of the built environment because you guys are just not conscious of what issues we have in terms of accessibility that is discriminatory. And so ADA, if you think about it, has reshaped how we design. Like I can't even put a countertop in without thinking about accessibility. I can't put, light switches in. And so that all, I think, is also intertwined, that I don't see that there's a difference or the ability to separate the two in my own experience. I'm sure people feel differently about it, but I do absolutely think that those two things are inseparable. So does that answer the question? I think that there's probably too many things that overlap with our responsibility to say that it's not our job to respond.
Yeah, thank you so much, Imani. I'm gonna pull that clip from the recording and like replay it when someone asks me that question again. I think both your framework of the kind of oath that we take as architects is really interesting and really pointed. Oh, I'm frozen again.
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Oh, good. Okay. I turned off my video because of my connection problems. So sorry about that. Mm-hmm. But no, thank you so much for that response. I think it was really great. And I hope that our students were listening. So I want to just give a chance for anyone who hasn't had an opportunity to ask a question yet to ask another question, either in the YouTube or in the Zoom. Feel free to either type a question in the chat or unmute yourself. Not seeing any showing up. So okay. So let's see if this works. Okay, so in that case, I think we'll wrap it up, Imani. Thank you so much. This was a really enlightening conversation and inspiring to me, and I really appreciate you spending the time and sharing these thoughts. And I really look forward to watching your research and your practice develop.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And like I said, if there are no questions or any comments or anything now, I'm really excited to see, and actually whenever I've presented this in the past, people respond like, I live in Des Moines and I just didn't know about some of these things, or like, I live in Vermont and we don't really, and like there's a lot of really interesting responses where either people are asking for more information or they're like, I now know that I have a different responsibility to my own, at least neighborhood, you know, not a whole world, but definitely a shift in their thoughts on the role of the profession. And so that's all I'm here for. So thank you for allowing me to spread anything with the students and faculty and professionals on the call potentially.
Thank you, Imani. Have a nice night, everybody.
Thanks. Good night. Do I get off now? I'm gonna.
Hold on one second. Okay. Yes. Okay. We are not streaming anymore.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks so much, Imani. I just wanted to hang around and say thank you.
Yeah, no, I was a little, I'm always just kind of like, does everyone know this already? Am I the only one who is like, is this redundant? Is this, I don't know. And a lot of times I think people outside of Detroit, like do or like, I think Detroiters